Hello everyone, welcome to Chapter 5. Let's jump right into it. Our lecture preview, and beginning with the endocrine system. And we've talked about the HPA system, that is the hypothalamus, pituitary gland, and adrenal system. And it's one way that we believe biologically that maternal stress is passed on to the fetus prenatally. Genetic and environmental forces are always working together. Even if you inherit a genetic predisposition to be tall, without proper nutrition, you are less likely to reach your full growth/developmental potential. Endocrine glands secrete chemicals called hormones, regulates the bloodstream. The pituitary gland is a critical endocrine gland, triggers the release of hormones, produces growth. Ovaries and testes secrete testosterone and androgen/estrogen and progesterone, which stimulate the production of growth hormones. So, as I was saying, this is one mechanism by which we believe that prenatal stress is transferred from the mother to the child, but also the pituitary gland is involved with all kinds of other hormones. For example, growth hormones, which literally trigger growth. And the idea with even if you inherit a genetic predisposition to be tall, it doesn't mean you're going to end up tall. That just speaks again to the impact of the environment prenatally and postnatally on development. So my research has found that prenatal stress, specifically being subjected to a military occupation during your first trimester, was associated with giving birth to children, shorter children, I should say. So again, the genetic predisposition towards certain heights interacting with environmental stressors, in that case, a military occupation. So researchers have tried to make stress research more accessible to people who, don't obsessively follow the latest biological information on stress. They're not deep in the weeds. So one way to conceptualize stress is good stress and toxic/bad stress. So good stress, personal growth, challenging but not overwhelming. Positive stress, more short term. We all need stress in our life to grow, to develop. We need challenges to develop new skills, find out who we are, for identity purpose, etc. So life is presented with stress. It's not the idea that all stress is bad. We need stress, but it needs to be short term and in certain circumstances. I look at toxic and bad stress, and this will make the differences quite clear. It's strong, frequent, and a prolonged activation of the body's stress response systems in the absence of the buffering protection of supportive adult relationships. And we've already talked about buffering, and again, that's kind of a protective factor, which reduces the impact of harms from a stressor and encourages growth. So often, the difference between good stress and bad stress is the absence of protective factors. Bad stress/toxic stress harms physical and cognitive growth. And an interesting concept that I want to highlight and I'm going to present throughout this course is ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. Child abuse or neglect, parental substance abuse, maternal depression, economic depression, war, cultural upheaval. And again, we've talked about this in other chapters, but just a reminder that ACEs are, as stated there, kind of a collection of stressors. What researchers do is add up the cumulative total of the ACEs, and then you see if it's associated or predictive of future outcomes, whether that's social, cognitive, biological, etc. And a video is embedded here is a nice illustration of that point. So principles of growth. Growth has a few kind of key principles. One is that growth occurs from the head to the tail, and you can see that in the figure to your right. And also, the growth begins and develops from the center outward. And finally, development starts globally and undifferentiated, moves towards increasing differentiation. So in the beginning of development, you're just seeing rapid development, but over time you see specialization and a hierarchy in speed and efficiency. And that specialization, that speed, that efficiency is in direct response to the environment. And we'll cover that shortly. So just kind of basic neuroscience here, but neurons are divided into the dendrite, cell body, and axon. Myelination which gives white matter its color. It increases the speed of transmission of neuron communications. It begins prenatally. The prefrontal cortex does not become fully myelinated until adolescence or early adulthood. It's linked with rapid cognitive improvements and is associated, and ACEs and prenatal stress decrease myelination. So on the left, you can see kind of this sheath that goes over the neuron, which allows for rapid or more rapid communication between neurons. That again allows for increased speed, which allows for greater efficiency, which allows for greater ability for children to perform complex cognitive tasks. So it's related to rapid improvements because you're not only forming new neurons, new connections, but it's the speed, it's that efficiency that really is linked to the rapid growth in cognitively, socially, biologically in humans. And as I stated, ACEs and prenatal stress are associated with decreased myelination. So again, a way by which we see that stress, and I should add not just prenatal but postnatal stress, is harmful on a biological level. So we talked about the HPA system, the hypothalamus, pituitary gland, adrenal system, and how that is one biological method by which stress is passed down intergenerationally through the release of cortisol. That's one hormone released from the HPA through the HPA, I should say, that crosses the placental barrier, and large amounts can be harmful to the fetus. We talked about ACEs. Now we'll talk about the developmental origins of health and disease theory. This is also known as the fetal programming hypothesis. So let's go through these bullet points. Events in early development are related to disease risk in later life. Underlying assumption is that there's a critical period of developmental plasticity in utero when many fetal tissues are especially plastic and sensitive to the maternal environment. During this period, the phenotype that is best adapted to the intrauterine environment is selected. If the intrauterine environment is stressful, the selected phenotype may be maladaptive in later life and result in increased risk for a number of diseases. So what does this mean? We got a lot of terms here, but kind of the first bullet point really sums it up best. Events in early development are related to disease risk in later life. So what these researchers argue is that during prenatal development, we all understand that there are rapid periods of development. You're literally developing organs, neurons, limbs, etc. Well, during that prenatal development, there are critical periods, or I should add, probably more correctly, sensitive periods. That is when those developing organs, those developing neural networks are especially sensitive to and susceptible to environmental stressors. So such as prenatal stress, whatever that is, maternal abuse, getting hit with a hurricane, a war, etc. And due to that sensitivity, that means that that development is especially plastic, and that means that those stressors, like I said, shape the phenotype, which is kind of the as reviewed in the previous chapter, that visible expression of genes. So the behavior that you see expressed from genes, or how tall someone is. So kind of that visible behavioral manifestations of genes within the environment. So it's literally the environment shaping the phenotype. So as a kind of an adaptive process. So the individual, for example, a developing fetus may be, receiving a lot of cortisol hormones prenatally, and that is telling the fetus, hey, something is really going on dangerous outside. So for example, I should leave the womb quicker and have a preterm birth. So prolonged extreme prenatal stress is associated with preterm birth. So researchers argue that, okay, the fetus is understanding that, oh, this environment outside is dangerous. I need to get out of the womb. Or another example is the programming. of the fetus's own stress response system. So say the fetus, one possible outcome of the prolonged prenatal stress is that a child's stress response system is either dampened. So imagine the child or the fetus, at a biological level, cellular level, understanding, oh, there's a lot of stress outside in the environment. Therefore, I should be born with a very high or low threshold for stress. One example with that would mean that, okay, I understand, again, broadly speaking, I understand. Okay, so the world outside is very stressful. So I'm going to program my biological system, my biological stress response system, in such a way that large levels of stress does not make me have a negative reaction. So I have a very dampened response to stress. So AKA I have internalizing problems. I don't express uh, my issue, my behavioral problems. I have low responsitivity to the environment. That's a biological adaptation to the understanding that the environment outside of the womb is very stressful. So one biological adaptation, that phenotype expression, is that I am not going to be responsive to the environment, which can have negative repercussions because when a mother and father or caregiver, etc., is trying to interact with the child, they're not as responsive to the child, which is harmful. They're not as responsive to the parenting that is harmful to development. So again, prenatal stress, programming a fetus's stress response system. In our example, that produces behaviorally, visibly phenotype. The phenotype would be an underreactive individual, a less responsive child to the environment, which interacts with the postnatal environment because they're unable to receive scaffolding and that responsive parenting, which then has long-term effects. Health is a lifelong process. It's influenced by behaviors and your environment. When you begin exercising matters. It's determined by genetic and environmental influences. A person's genetic predispositions interact with their environmental experience to create outcomes. Both improves and declines over the lifespans in response to many factors. Health occurs in socio-historical contexts and can be enhanced or constrained by social, political, economic, and historical factors. So, for example, life expectancy falling during the first 6 months of 2020 and life expectancy dropping during World War II. So those are kind of obvious examples. During a war, during a pandemic, more people will die, which will decrease health outcomes because it's decreasing life expectancy. But kind of expanding on that genetic predisposition point, again, it's, just because a person is born genetically vulnerable, a genetic predisposition for diabetes, obesity, etc., does not mean that that individual is going to develop diabetes, is going to suffer from complications related to obesity. It's genetic predisposition plus environmental triggers that activate that gene that makes that person more at risk for diabetes, for example. So you can think of it as an on and off switch, wherein the environment or activate, turn on, flip on that switch of that genetic predisposition towards diabetes or something like an externalizing problem in school. So we know about the HPA axis. We know about the hormone cortisol. We know about the fetal programming hypothesis or the origins of disease theory. Now let's look at allostatic load. The probability to have an allostatic load of 4 or higher as predicted by race and gender. Now, allostatic load is a measure, it's kind of like ACEs, but it's a cumulative measure of a biological wear and tear on a system. So you can think of heightened cholesterol, high blood pressure, etc. And just like ACEs, you researchers or doctors or MDs, I should say, the total number of basically stressors at a biological level, again, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, etc. So a long list of the medical kind of red flags, risks, and they sum them all up and get a risk score. Well, a famous researcher, kind of this is like a seminal study, she found that in each age group, the mean score for blacks was roughly comparable to that for whites who were 10 years older. So this is literally kind of a measurement of cellular, of biological aging, of weathering, it's sometimes referred to. And on a biological level, the mean score for blacks was roughly compared to that for whites who were 10 years older. And this is Black Americans and white Americans. So that's basically saying that when you look at that summation of all those scores, of all those biological risk factors, they equated to about 10 years of Black Americans being 10 years older than white Americans. Black women bared a large burden of allostatic load compared with either Black men or white women. We found little differences among whites in mean score by gender until 55 years old. However, Black women had higher scores than Black men at all ages. Double jeopardy, intersectionality, interaction. So this is kind of relates to the idea of intersectionality. So for Black women, that second bullet point, they bear the largest burden of allostatic load. So it's not only them catching those biological impacts of being Black American, but also of being a woman American. So that coming together at the biological level, creating a higher allostatic load for that group within this historical period. And another term for that is intersectionality, double jeopardy, and interaction, for my statistics people in the class. Depending on what age and gender you're in, the higher allostatic loads you have. We talked about ACEs, we talked about allostatic load, we talked about cortisol, we talked about fetal programming. Now let's look at deaths of despair. The US life expectancy drops for third year in a row, reflecting rising drug overdoses and suicide. This is a headline I grabbed from the Smithsonian, and the links are in the description, or in the notes tab, I should say. That's the longest sustained decline in expected lifespan since the period of 1915 to 1918. The suicide rate among urban residents is 11 per 100,000, as opposed to rural residents, 20 per 1,000, linked to industrialization, loss of identity in society. So what we're seeing here is white non-Hispanics, and I'm not going to go through each one of these charts, but the over kind of arching theme here is that white non-Hispanics aged in the upper 40s to low 50s are seeing declines in their life expectancy. This is not something you expect to see as technology advances and life expectancy going up. Well, for this group, it's going down. So why is that the case? And it kind of goes back to those Bronfenbrenner systems that we talked about, in chapter, whatever it was, 2 or 3. Politics of the moment, the historical era, the economics of a particular era impact development. So these researchers have termed this the deaths of despair. And they argue that deindustrialization, loss of identity, and kind of dignity in society, in work, has kind of caused a massive population-wide, within this population, stressor, a trauma that is causing individuals to commit suicide, use drugs and abuse drugs, most importantly, leading to the death of and the stagnation and the decline in life expectancy among these groups. So there's just another example of our socio-cultural conditions impacting our developmental outcomes. I discussed in previous slides this idea that we as organisms adapt to our environments. You see this at the prenatal level when I talked about genotypes, but you also see this postnatally throughout childhood development and adult development. So let's talk about neuroplasticity. Developing brains have plasticity. Nervous system's ability to change / adapt over time and customizes the brain. Much of development in infancy and childhood is related to increasing and decreasing neural connections. We have synaptogenesis and synaptic pruning. Children in poverty experience slower rates of brain growth during infancy and childhood. So, as I said, our brains in our development is always reflective and impacted by our environments. And we see this at a neuron level. So through synaptogenesis, that is the formation of new synapses. So kind of deprived environments where there's little stimulation and a lot of stress are linked to lower levels of synaptogenesis. And you need these synapses, again, these connections between neurons within the brain that form these larger neural networks that allow a child to develop complex cognitive and social skills. And synaptic pruning, consisting of this death of neurons, remove connections that aren't useful, use them or lose them. So it's not only that through an enriching environment that we're developing these networks, but by not having that enriching environment, it prunes, it decreases neurons. It literally is the death of neurons because our brain is adapting and being shaped, molded, that plastic brain being molded by our environment, creating these complex neural systems that are designed to be adapted to their particular environment. So it may be that being having externalizing problems, a little kid kicking, screaming, not waiting their turn, typical externalizing problems are adaptive because maybe the child believes that if they do that, they'll receive more attention. They'll receive more. They have a higher likelihood of receiving the inputs that they need to properly develop. But we understand that in a school setting, that externalizing symptoms, that adaptation can be maladaptive in other settings. So that's just one way that that adaptation, that disease, that fetal programming, but not just fetal programming, but postnatal programming, uh, starts a lifelong process by which certain behaviors are adaptive in some circumstances, but not in others. And you can see that for health measures as well. So, for example, if the child is nourished during as a fetus, the child will be born lighter, and that makes sense, right? Because okay, I have less food in this in environment, so I'm going to be smaller, and then I have a better chance of living. But we know that postnatally, that having stunting is bad for future health outcomes. So it's adaptive. It allows the child. So being low birth weight or being short, adaptive, but also maladaptive over the long term. Reflexes, unlearned or involuntary response to a stimulus. They're survival reflexes, so it's just eye blinking, sucking, and they're for adaptive value needed to survive. So you need to blink or you're going to go blind. So these are behaviors that are not they do not have to be taught to a fetus or sorry, I should say an infant. You don't need to teach your child how to blink. They are born knowing that it's a reflex. Primitive reflexes are suspected to be remnants from evolutionary history. So this is basically what there are as we through evolution. At some point, these behaviors were adaptive, but they're kind of just left in our gene pool now. So, for example, what adaptive advantage does fanning toes have when feet are stroked? So if you stroke a infant's feet, they'll fan their toes. It's tough to see at this stage of our evolution what the purpose of that is, but it's probably some remnant of previous evolutionary necessity. Newborn behavioral states, 2/3 of infants sleep through the night. Newborns spend half of their sleeping hours in REM sleep. Infants older than 6 spend only 25% to 30%. REM is important for kind of development. So we see this in studies of rats. If you deprive rats of REM sleep, they will show evidence, or we'll find that their hippocampus is actually decreased in size, and they have less synaptogenesis, so less complex neuro networks within their brain, because it's believed that, or it's evidence for the fact that REM sleep is kind of consolidates memories, important for neurological development. And obviously, we can't do that with children, but animal models suggest, and other human experiments suggest that it serves a similar process in humans. Health and wellness. 12% of babies are premature, but premature birth account for 35% of infant deaths. Well, for gestational age, preterm birth, LBW is linked with prenatal stress, cumulative parental stress, poverty, political violence. And congenital malformations, effects that are present at birth, leading cause of death. So I just grabbed one study to kind of show an interesting example of this. So following 9/11, there was increased Islamophobia in the country. And what these researchers in California did was they looked at birth records of individuals who were thought to be Muslim and or Arab within California. They looked at the birth records of those parents in the 6 months following September 11th, and they looked at those same exact 6 calendar months, but the year before, so from 2000 and 2000, and then they compared those birth records from 2000, and they compared it to the birth records from post September 2001. What did they find? They found that compared with the same 6 calendar months 1 year earlier, the relative risk of giving birth to children with worse birth outcomes, that is, preterm birth and low birth weight, was higher for the cohort of children born after 9/11. So even on the other side of the countries, these mothers, feeling the threat of Islamophobia, racism, etc., stressing out to mothers to such extent that it produced a higher risk of giving birth to a child with low birth weight and small for gestational age children. So again, these large-scale population traumas impacting development and impacting certain groups in specific ways. In this case, Muslim or Arab descent mothers being at greater risk for giving birth to a child with low birth weight and a child that is small for gestational age. So let's look at brain lateralization. Lateralization is asymmetry and specialization of function. The left hemisphere controls the right side of the body. The right hemisphere controls the left side of the body. They work together through the corpus callosum, though they are not two separate brains. The corpus callosum is known as the superhighway of neurons connected to the two halves of the brains. Both hemispheres play a role in activities. If one hemisphere is damaged, neuroplasticity allows the other region to try and take over. So straightforward. The right side of your body is controlled by your left hemisphere and vice versa. But these are not two separate brains. They're connected, they work together, and they're connected through the corpus callosum through a superhighway of neurons, which consists of high level of myelination, which we just learned that is critical for efficient, complex behavior within humans. And there's evidence of neuroplasticity, as I said. So if you have damage, just say, I'll make up something to the right hemisphere, the other parts of your brains will adapt and try to kind of pick up the slack and find out new creative ways for you to be able to perform the same tasks that whatever that brain region specialized in. So it's kind of, again, this plasticity, this adaptation that is inherent in human brains. Physical behavior. Toddlers capable of controlling their movements in relation to a stationary world. They learn to modify their movements to adapt to changes, environment, as well as changes in their own bodies. Throwing accuracy increases with age. So as a child, we're just seeing that motor movement is developing, and children are increasingly able to do more complex neural movements because they have better coordination, they have more strength, and they're used to the biomechanics of their body. Health and wellness. Motor vehicles crashes cause the largest number of fetal injuries in children. Nutrition. Most children do not eat recommended daily amount of fruits and vegetables. Young children eat more comfortable foods when living in stressful households. Breakfast programs improve children's physical health and increase cognitive development. Physical activity Neighborhoods that provide safe outdoor activities have fewer overweight children. Executive, both improve executive function, which are evident in fMRI studies, are associated with after-school high-intensity exercise programs. It promotes social, cognitive, and physical health and is a protective factor. So our big takeaways here are that nutrition is important, but again, this is another example of the environment impacting behavior. And we all understand this now. You're stressed out about a test or whatever's going on in your life, and you're gonna say, hey, let me get that Chipotle because I'm stressed and I want to eat. And that's the same thing with children. So loud noise, fighting, family violence is associated with eating comfort foods, eating less healthy. And we see a protective factor. And back to the Bronfenbrenner's kind of model, that breakfast programs improve physical health and increase cognitive development. So breakfast behaviors could be, and is one mechanism by which we can address poor developmental outcomes in children who are growing up in poverty or majority minority schools, which are typically underfunded. And looking at physical activity, kind of the same idea. Exercise is good for you, breaking news. It promotes all kinds of outcomes and it serves as a protective factor. So stress being dampened, the effects of a stressor being dampened, being lessened because physical exercise, physical activity buffers, it protects or at least offers partial protection to an individual. The adolescent brain. Volume of gray matter increases, peaks, and then decreases throughout the teen years, associated with increase in atogenesis just before puberty, and followed by increased pruning. White matter increases in linear fashion, reflects increased myelination. So kind of straightforward here. We see a rapid increases in atogenesis, allowing for that growth, that specialization, that susceptibility to the environment, and then pruning. So what neurosystems weren't as used as much during that specific period, resulting in pruning because they did not receive environmental inputs that activate those neuronal networks. So again, kind of that notion of use it or lose it. And the more you use it, the more strengthened those neuronal networks become, that more myelination, the more efficient, the more better those skills, those capabilities are for an adolescent. Adolescent brain. Theory of brain changes during adolescence might relate to risky behavior. Brain's reward systems are hyper responsive. Adolescent brain has greater need for reward. Self-control regulation is not matured. Frontal lobes have less myelination associated with higher order thinking. So these are just kind of thinking or theories on why adolescents may be at more risk for riskier behavior. Some people argue is that the self-control regulation has not yet matured, and that may be reflected in a lack of or a relatively less myelination in the frontal lobe compared to other parts of the brain. And the frontal lobe is important for self-regulation and higher order thinking, planning, decision making. So now I want to look at some cross-cultural studies. And I grabbed an interesting study that analyzed 175 different pre-industrial societies. Why in pre-industrial societies? Because often we think, oh, just because something occurs in our society means that it's universal. It's this biological innate process within humanity that teenagers / adolescents take or make risky decisions. So let's look at what they found. The researchers discovered evidence for both similarities and differences. All the cultures viewed adolescence as a distinct period of life, separate from childhood and adulthood, in which some restructuring and role learning occurred. The expectation for antisocial behavior was present in only 44% of societies with respect to boys, and only 18% for girls. The majority of the culture studies did not expect teenagers to be disobedient. Notion that adolescence is universally associated with violence received little support. 13% of societies expected adolescent boys to be occasionally violent, and only 3% such expectation for girls. So this is a large study that supports the argument that adolescent risk-taking, violence, disobedience is not a universal phenomenon seen across all cultures, aka is not this biological, innate social process that occurs across adolescence, and thus our environments matter, our culture matters, our politics matters. That those conditions, those environmental factors, those systems, as Bronfenbrenner would say, impact adolescent risk-taking. And one other study, which explored how risk-taking behavior varied as a function of environmental hardship in 77 countries. There is a general trend the world over for people to take fewer risks as they age, and for boys to be greater risk seekers than girls. However, risk-seeking behaviors were influenced by the harshness of the environment. In places with lower life expectancy, more income inequality, lower income levels, people took more risks, and the risky behaviors did not change as sharply with age. The pattern seems to be because living with scarce resources demands more competition, and consequently, more risky behaviors across the lifespan, not just in adolescence. So this research kind of provides evidence for the argument that it's not that all of a sudden an adolescence hits X years old and they're a completely different person. So kind of like this stage idea, this qualitative shift of an individual. And now all of a sudden they went from a great child to just, out of control teenager, kind of, that old stereotype. This study found that there's mostly continuity between the risky behaviors as a child and adolescence. And that is because the harshness of the environment, the lack of resources, short life span, income inequality, lower income levels are what's driving these risk-taking behaviors for a lot of reasons. You can imagine that in an area with scarce resources, you have to take more risks to be able to survive. So again, it's kind of adaptive to be more risky in that circumstance, but that adaptation has consequences, and that is possibly lower life expectancy, more criminal behavior, more violence, etc. So that environment producing that risky behaviors, because risky behaviors serve an a temporary adaptive function, but potentially is harmful to the individual and to that country and culture. Adolescent growth spurt, triggered by an increase in the level of growth hormones circulating throughout the body during adolescence. Girls' peak rate of growth for height is 12 years, weight 12.5, boys 13, and weight about 14 years old. So kind of what we see, we've grew up knowing is girls have a growth spurt before teenage boys, or preteen boys and girls, I should say. Sexual maturation. Hypothalamus stimulates activity in the adrenal system, which accelerates changes in sexual and physical maturation. Boys and girls have similar levels of both male and female hormones during childhood. Adrenal glands increase production of androgens between 6 and 8 years of age, which contributes to secondary sex characteristics, such as pubic and underarm hair. First menstruation occurs between ages 11 and 15, and this is dependent on the historical era and what country you're in. And boys' first ejaculation around 13 years of age. So again, this biological process that the hypothalamus stimulates through releasing hormones in the body. And we talked about cortisol, but also it's not like all the hypothalamus is bad. They release hormones that are needed for growth, which is physical growth and sexual maturation. History of sexual and physical growth. Secular trend. Historic trend in industrialized societies toward earlier maturation and greater body size. In 1840, the average age of a young girl's first period, and in this case, a teenage girl, was 16 and a half years old, a full 4 years later than it is today. explanations or possible explanations: better nutrition, advances in medical care, and exposure to certain chemicals. Americans are taller today than they were in 1900, more likely today to reach genetic potential. So this goes back to what I was alluding to before, is that your historical era matters because you're exposed to different nutrition, different chemicals, so good and bad, advances in medical care. And the idea here is that through these advances, for some individuals at least, not all groups, some groups are more likely to reach their full genetic potential because they get proper nutrition, better medical care, uh, more responsive environments, etc. Let's talk about some of the psychological implications of puberty. Girls experiencing puberty can become self-conscious about their appearance. Early developers experience behavior and adjustment problems. Presenting mental health indicators predict mental health issues during puberty. Late developers are less disadvantaged than boys. So this is kind of like what I mentioned in a previous slide. It's not that always, or even mostly, or commonly, I should say, that an individual child is securely attached, she's having a great life, and then all of a sudden, oh, she hits some artificial age, and oh man, it's complete chaos. It's that it's important to keep in mind, I should say, that pre-existing mental health indicators predict mental health issues during puberty. And early developers experience behavior and adjustment problems for a lot of reasons. So you can become a part of a more sexually active crowd at a younger age. It may make you more likely to hang around older children who are participating in drug use or other behaviors that are not conducive to school success, or just generally bullying from their because of their development during puberty. Boys are rate changes more positively. Slower growing boys demonstrate anxiety and at times perform lower on achievement tests. Early developing boys enjoy greater social acceptance. So in the case for boys, you kind of have that anxiety of I'm too short, I'm not. I've seen my peers become men, and I'm just still a boy, and that could be associated with certain educational outcomes. And for them, having that confidence may lead to greater social acceptance, but at the same time, kind of like similar for the teenage girls, that can be associated with higher risk behaviors. Child perceptions of puberty affects psychological outcomes. So it matters if a child believes that this is going to be the worst period of my life, that has a negative effect on a child. It's not purely that way, but that it does have an effect. Sleep. Only 20% of teens get the optimum amount of sleep on school nights, associated with decreased motivation. Insufficient sleep is associated with depression and increased emotional response to frustration, higher levels of depression, irritability. Insufficient sleep harms learning. We talked about in the rat models that lack of sleep, lack of REM sleep, and sleep in general, is associated with decreased memory, with, in the case of the rats, decreased brain areas that are associated with learning, with memorization. And we see similar associations with humans. This has led to some people advocating that you push high school back because you have a higher workload and you need more sleep, but you're getting less sleep. And we see kind of that issue with correlation, that directionality problem that we talked about a few chapters ago. Where is it that sleep is associated with depression? So is lack of sleep causing depression? Or is a person depressed? And as Kid Cudi would say, that lonely, not in this case stoner, but that lonely person is up at night, and then they have or are more likely to have insufficient sleep. So you got that directionality problem, right? And it's probably some combination of the two. The changing brain. Development is a lifelong process, established at day one. Neurogenesis, process of generating new neurons. Mice who exercise a lot form new neurons. Increased blood flows in the hippocampus following a 3-month aerobic exercise program linked to learning and memory. So we already talked about that a lack of sleep is associated with decreased hippocampus blood levels and volume size. But exercise is associated with increased blood volumes in the hippocampus, which is again is linked to memory and learning. And this is a process called neurogenesis. So it used to be believed that you're just born with X amount of neurons and there's some changes, but you can't generate new neurons. But new research has suggested otherwise, that new neurons can be can be generated in later adulthood. Elderly adults may end up with 5 to 30% fewer neurons in early adulthood. Neuron loss greater in areas that control sensory and motor activities, greater integration of left and right hemispheres. So the idea here is that even though there is a decrease in neurons, the decrease is concentrated in motor activities. You know, things become it becomes more difficult to move around, but you see greater integration. So again, is that brain adapting? The brain recognizing that, okay, I'm losing neurons in some certain parts of my brain, and this is broadly speaking, but I'm going to adapt. I'm going to integrate and do things that I usually did more efficiently. So it's kind of a problem solving process on a biological level that's aided by problem solving and behaviorally, that helps to try and compensate for the decline of neurons as in older adults. Scaffolding theory in aging and compensation. Older adults adapt by recruiting brain areas not associated with younger adult task performance. And that's what I'm saying. That's kind of just a theory for it. So we adapt. We find new ways to do things. And that becomes evident neurologically, that adaptation. And you can actually see younger adults and older adults performing the same task, but using different neuron systems to achieve the same goal. The changing female reproductive system. We have premenstrual syndrome, and we have PDD. Premenstrual syndrome symptoms include bloating, moodiness, breast tenderness, and headaches. 10% of women experience symptoms which interfere with daily activities. And 2 to 3% of women who are diagnosed with symptoms severe enough to disrupt working relationships for PDD. Little pre-menstruation mood change is found in studies, maybe expectations more than hormones. However, there is cross-cultural evidence for premenstrual syndrome and PDD. So the idea here is that, again, that there's that your behaviors, who you are, is predictive of who you are after a certain event, whether that's puberty or another change in the reproductive systems. And expectations may serve a role in the symptoms, but the evidence of premenstrual syndrome and premenstrual dysphoric disorder are found cross-culturally. And menopause is just a definition, ending of a woman's menstrual periods in midlife. Moving on to changes in the male reproductive system. Andropause, age associated with hypogonadism, which is slowly decreasing levels of testosterone, low libido, memory problems, erection problems, loss of pubic hair. By 8, men have between 8 and 50% of testosterone they had at 20 years old. By 8. Moving on to the male reproductive system. Andropause is the age-associated hypogonadism. It's slowly decreasing levels of testosterone, which as well as low libido, fatigue and lack of energy, erection problems, memory problems, loss of pubic hair. By 80 years old, men have between 10 and 50% of testosterone they had at 20. However, there is not a clear association between testosterone level and andropause symptoms. So there's probably a wide variety of environmental reasons for a low libido and memory problems as well. Health and wellness. 30 and older age group typically have at least one chronic impairment, sensory loss, arthritis, hypertension, degenerative disease. Osteoporosis, disease in which a serious loss of minerals leaves the bones fragile and easily fractured. Nearly 1/3 of elderly adults who fracture a hip die within a year after experiencing a fall, reduced physical activities. So kind of a key takeaway here is that after a fall, after a serious injury, older adults, and I mean I think adults in general, take the approach that I'm not going to use this thing. I don't want to get injured again. So I'm not going to use this muscle anymore, which makes them more vulnerable to future injuries. And you kind of get this cascading effect of risk for older adults following an injury. Enhancing health. Compared with older non-athletes, older athletes had higher oxygen uptake capacity. Aging adults feel less stressed and happier when they exercise. Exercise can enhance their cognitive functioning, can delay the onset of physical disabilities. Older adults who are socially isolated and lonely reduce their physical activity than those who maintain strong social connections. You should increase exercise as you age. So big takeaways here is that exercising matters. Your behaviors matter. They impact your long-term health. And that is evident in moods, in cognitive functioning, in physical disabilities. And one reason for that is not just purely the exercise, but that social isolation, or exercising reduces social isolation. And when you're socially isolated, you have less social interactions, you're less cognitively and socially stimulated, and that is harmful at a biological level and at a psychological level. And you should increase exercise as you age. So a lot of people kind of think of the opposite approach, but really your body needs that exercise. It can't get away with the lower levels of exercise that it could early on in their life, or are less likely to, I should say. So it's important to actually increase exercise activities as you age. Theories of aging, program theories of aging, and damage and error theories of aging. So we're going to look at these two theories. The first emphasizes the systematic genetic control of aging processes. The Hayflick limit: cells can only divide a certain number of times. Telomeres, which are types of chromosomes, shorten with every cell division. So this argument is basically saying that cells can only divide a certain amount of times. Once you hit that X amount of divisions within that cell dies, and that accumulative loss of cellular death leads to death, which would be evident in telomeres, which are the tips of chromosomes shortened with every cell division. So with each cell division, those telomeres get shorter, and that's kind of a biological marker of cellular aging, and it contributes to death. So damage and error theories of aging: wear and tear from the accumulation of random damage to cells and organs throughout life. So this is kind of just like a random accumulation of damage that eventually leads to death. It's random, and free radicals are toxic byproducts of metabolism. So every time something metabolizes, every breath you take, it creates these free radicals, and these free radicals accumulate, and then they are linked to cancers, cardiovascular disease, and Alzheimer's disease. So continuing on, evidence for programming theory, we have the Hayflick limit, which we just reviewed, and that says cells can only divide a certain amount of times, and then after it hits that limit, then cells die, and then there's not enough cells, and then you're dead. Telomeres, which we reviewed, stretches of DNA that forms the tips of chromosomes, shortened with every cell division. Now, what's interesting here is that chronic stress, so class, physical illnesses or conditions such as obesity, diabetes, exercise, smoking, exposure to war, natural disasters shorten telomere lengths. Our biological age is affected by weathering. So this is another example of that accumulated effect of stress harming an individual at a DNA level, that chromosome level, that biological level. So we see that weathering, that accumulation, and impacting the biological age of an individual. And actually my lab and the University of Florida was looking into this in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And studies support this as outlined below. So a lot of people think, oh, just because something happens at a genetic level or biological level, it's free of environment. It's an innate process that exists. No, we see that the environment literally impacts people at a chromosomal level. In this case, telomeres, as a suspected kind of a marker of biological age, showing evidence of a decrease in size due to the accumulation of stress, or chronic stress, that is. Evidence for damage theory. Free radicals are toxic byproducts of metabolism, which are associated with Alzheimer's that we already talked about, produced when oxygen reacts with certain molecules in the cells, and age spots are visible signs of damage from free radicals. So just by breathing, by metabolizing, by being alive, you produce free radicals, and over time, those free radicals accumulate and are harmful to your life. Another seminal study is Snowdon's nun study. 678 nuns ranging in age from 75 to 106 years. Similar in class, housing, healthcare, and diet. Level of education affected longevity and health. Those with college degrees lived longer and were more independent. Those who were more active were both physically and mentally lived longer and healthier, wrote autobiographies decades earlier. Vocab complexity was associated with symptoms of Alzheimer's. So this is a longitudinal study we learned about chapters ago, and they found that, as outlined here, the nuns with the highest degree of education live longer, and that could be for a lot of reasons: access to resources, more cognitively stimulating environments, living in safer environments, having access to healthcare, especially in the United States, having better quality food, etc. And an interesting aspect of this is this autobiographical point. So you can look at, or they found, so they had independent reviewers look at the autobiographies of these nuns, and they found an association between the complexity of the vocab and future symptoms of Alzheimer's. Now, what that exactly says, there's a lot of interpretation there, but the idea here is that this may be a marker of Alzheimer's disease decades before you actually see the symptoms of Alzheimer's fully manifest. Um, so that could be a risk factor where you can target early intervention, or represents an opportunity to provide more stimulation for those nuns, or any individual who has lower vocab complexity at this age. So that's all for this week. Thanks everyone for tuning in. I hope you have a great week, and I will see you soon.